Hey everyone, it's Dale, and today we're going to talk about broadcast news ethics, an incredibly important topic, and it's one that I'm going to break down into two different videos. The first thing we're going to talk to is about ethical decision making, and then the second video will cover ethical situations within news gathering that you'll have to face. Whenever we talk about ethics, I usually show this cartoon because Calvin and Hobbes is awesome for one. And two, it really sums up what it's like to have to worry about ethics. So Calvin says, I read this ethics book. The mom asks what he thinks. Said it made him see things a lot differently. It's given him a lot to think about. She says, glad you enjoyed it. And he said, it's complicating my life. Don't get me anymore. Uh, that's what it comes down to when we deal with ethics in journalism, especially because it makes our life difficult. It's not easy to do things ethically, but it's incredibly important and the best of reporters, as you've seen with some examples of what not to do with the Brian Williams of the world and the like. The best of reporters really do value ethics and try to do things in the correct way. A lot of times, it's a matter of managing conflicts of interest, which we're going to talk about. Uh, but what it is not avoiding risk. So we have to take risks sometimes in journalism. So there's no way to avoid risk and just be the most bland journalist in the world. So we'll talk about those two things in depth here today. The first thing I want to cover is that everyone has biases. This means reporters, anchors, producers, anyone in the newsroom. We There's this common misconception that reporters and other types of journalists are these nameless, faceless, emotionless, thoughtless robots. That's not the case. We all have life experiences. We all have values. We all have biases and beliefs. So it really comes down to how do we handle those biases and still remain independent while doing a story. For instance, I'm a single white guy. I'm a Christian. I'm a Democrat. Not only do I not own a gun, if you've been following me on Twitter the past week or two, you probably know my feelings about guns. Saying all that, I'm fairly open with those biases and those opinions. Let's say there was a Second Amendment rally in downtown San Marcos and Bobcat Update sent me out to cover it. Could I do a good job in covering that story? Uh, I would like to think so. I would like to think I could put my biases aside and go out and fairly cover that story and give it the attention it deserves. Um, but there are other reporters who may not feel that way, or there might be some in your newsroom where you're like, man, they're like in this too deep. I don't know that they can do that. So you have to realize there are times where you can most definitely report on a lot of these issues, but there are some times to distance. Um, so what it comes down to is finding ways to report around our biases. Uh, this is the important question to ask. Does my cause benefit from my report? So I often at this time bring up a reporter friend of mine who is a pit bull lover. And when I say she's a pit bull lover, I mean she's one of those pit bull lovers. Like she's out to prove that pit bulls can be just as friendly and loving as any other type of dog, which is a noble goal. But every time we'd have to do a story about dogs or about pets, guess which types of dogs she put in her story. It got to the point where we, kind of jokingly, kind of not jokingly, we're like, hey, can we show some other dogs sometimes in some stories? Because she made it quite clear that she wanted her cause to benefit from every type of story that she was doing. Again, not that she was doing anything malicious, but there was a point where may have crossed a line or two. So you have to be careful with those. And like I said, there are times to distance, especially if a family member or a very close friend is running for political office. You, as the reporter or the producer or the anchor, need to step back and say, hey, I can't be involved with this story. Not only that, the station needs to let the audience know that you're connected to that story. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. Also, when you are your family member or a very close friend is a member of or part of a crime, whether that's a victim or a suspect in a crime, you need to stay away from that story as a journalist. So let others. That doesn't mean your newsroom will not cover it. It means someone else in the newsroom needs to do the reporting and take the lead on it. And what it all boils down to, again, is transparency. So transparency is key in a lot of these ethical decisions. Al Tompkins in our book says the public has a need to know about personal conflicts that compromise the journalist's independence. Merely disclosing the conflicts does not absolve the journalist, but the disclosure gives viewers a filter through which they can see and sort the information. So what he means is saying that, hey, my dad is running for mayor, just to be clear, I won't be covering the stories, but we felt it was ethical to let the viewers at home know. So if a newsroom does that, and my dad's running for mayor, and even though I'm not covering the story, then the station runs 10 straight stories slamming my dad's opponent. Now the viewers at home have that information. They have that filter, right? So that's not to say what you're doing is correct, but you've given them that transparency, though, to which they can probably say, you know what, I'm not going to pay attention to this station anymore because I don't think I'm getting fair information. Couple of things to look for when talking about retaining independence. That may mean resisting groups that may become newsworthy. These could be nonprofits. They could be political groups, especially activist groups. So you have to be really careful in terms of public displays of political affiliation, especially. There used to be days when you'd walk into a newsroom and every cubicle had posters and stickers of that person's favorite politician. Those days have kind of gone away, but you can imagine what it was like walking into a newsroom on a tour back then, and if you saw nothing but George Bush stickers everywhere, you would assume, okay, well, this station is obviously very right wing, or just the opposite if it was Bill Clinton back in the day or whatever. So we had to be very careful, and we weren't back then. You have to also be careful on your cars or in your yard, stuff like that. Just again, no one's telling you can't have that opinion, but be careful of how you're displaying it. You also have to consider charities as a situation to watch out for, especially if the charity has some potential road bumps is probably a good way to put it. For instance, I used to do a lot of work with Komen, and Komen by some is viewed as a pro-abortion group. Which isn't the case, but there are some who mistakenly believe that. And so there are commonly protests at Komen events, stuff like that. So if you join or you're supporting a group like that, just be aware of the potential roadblocks. Also, be really careful when you're appearing at rallies. Reporters should only be at rallies to cover them. You shouldn't MC rallies, especially political rallies. Probably shouldn't even appear at rallies unless you're there to cover it. So just be careful with stuff like that. Accepting gifts is a major part in terms of ethics with broadcast, because you will come into opportunities where people try to give you stuff. And this is one where I would tell you I'd be lying if I said I never took gifts from people. I didn't necessarily consider them gifts at the time, but looking back on it, they were most definitely gifts. And I would do things differently now if I were back in a newsroom. So Tompkins, in our book, has something that he calls the stand and snack rule in terms of accepting a gift. What he means by that is if you can stand at a table and have a cup of coffee and maybe a cookie or two, that's okay. So you go to a live event, let's say at the, Central Texas Medical Center in San Marcos. You're there to cover a press conference. And they've provided coffee for journalists and some light snacks. If the gift is light enough for you to sit there and have a cup of coffee and a cookie or a biscuit or something, Tompkins thinks that's okay. Where it crosses the line is when that becomes a 5-course meal with alcohol, stuff like that. That is now a gift. That is no longer a snack. That is could be well-intentioned. They may not be doing that to persuade coverage, but the cynical person would say that's exactly what the company is doing. So you have to be really careful with that. Also, one other thing in terms of gifts, I'm going to go back to this slide. Like I said, there are a lot of times where you don't even know these things are gifts. Journalists get a lot of access to things, so you can call in and be like, hey, can I go to this concert this weekend? They're like, yeah, sure, just ask for so-and-so at the door. That's a gift. That's a gift from the organization or from the venue, so you have to be careful with those types of things. From Tompkins again, the key question for journalists is not whether there is a conflict of interest, merely that appearance of a conflict of interest is important. So, if the public constantly sees you behind the scenes at a concert venue, uh, not in a working situation or not in a journalistic situation, and then you're called on to do a story on that venue, maybe they're avoiding their taxes or something like that. The public's not going to trust you on that story. So that appearance of conflict of interest is just as bad as a real one. What about arrests? Arrests are news, right? When famous people get arrested, especially. So, despite the fact that Lindsay Lohan's been arrested a number of times, it's still news when she gets arrested. Same thing for Justin Bieber. I don't necessarily think those are news, but I will concede that they regularly do make newscasts, especially CNN, TMZ, and the like. When Governor Perry, who was a sitting governor, was arrested, that is most definitely news. So it's pretty common across the way that when prominent people are arrested, we cover their arrests. But what about when a journalist is arrested? Do you see these on the news quite often? Arrests happen, and I think we're seeing it more and more now because newsrooms know there's no way to hide this. But back in the day, back before social media, it was fairly easy to hide an arrest if something bad happened in your newsroom, and it maybe wasn't something, where someone was hurt. Maybe it was a DWI and no one was injured in any type of wreck or anything like that. You might have been able to get away with it back in the day. But these days, when a journalist gets arrested, there usually is a story about it. So that's one change that's happened lately. What about layoffs? What happens when the Bobs come to town and lay off people in your company? You want to say it's one of the biggest companies in town and they have major layoffs. That's news, right? But what happens when there's a layoff in your newsroom? That typically doesn't make news. So it's pretty hypocritical, right? I remember there were several times where we as a newsroom were very quick to report on the layoffs at the newspaper, but yet when we had layoffs in our newsroom or another TV station had layoffs, we didn't report on them because we didn't want that news out there. That made our industry look bad. It made us look bad. Again, and that's not ethically correct. So I tend to think that we're getting better with these decisions. And again, transparency is key because it's really hard to hide anything these days. There's something called the separation of church and state when it comes to newsrooms. So you might know that from government class, but this also applies in newsrooms, and that church and state is the newsroom and the sales office. So in the past, these two entities remained separate. The news people didn't talk to salespeople. People didn't talk to newsrooms. That's changing quite a bit in the landscape of journalism these days. But the bottom line is that sales shouldn't be dictating what news is covered. So in other words, coverage shouldn't be for sale. Like I said, this is changing quite frequently. Across the board when you have native advertisement, or you have those bottom two things there, showing favoritism to advertisers or creating vehicles for advertisers, creating stories, creating content for advertisers. So a lot of these are changing, but when sales and business or news and business are kept separate, it builds really high morale and trust in management. When it comes to the web, this ship has already sailed. News and business are almost one and the same. So it's kind of hard to talk about separation of church and state when it comes to digital journalism because that, like I said, that ship has already sailed. But it does, there is still a separate nature in terms of a lot of newsrooms. Some newsrooms have put salespeople in charge of the news department, which that's quite frightening for a lot of people. So it's changing landscape. Things are changing. We have to adjust, but typically we still try to keep news and business as separate entities. I mentioned risk, and if you're doing nothing but trying to avoid risk, you're probably not going to. Journalism's probably not the field for you because journalism is messy. We sometimes bring people down. We bring corporations down. We bring bad guys down. We expose corruption if we're doing our job correctly. And so there are times where, you could potentially put someone in jail or cause a bunch of layoffs because you brought a company down. Journalism is messy, and Tompkins says if we start our decision-making process by asking how can we cause the least harm, we won't report many stories. Sometimes you do have to cause some harm when it means exposing something or shedding light on the truth. And so you have to be prepared for that. If you're very risk adverse, journalism may not be the field for you. You're going to run into a lot of angry people telling you no and refusing to talk to you. You might also run into people who try to take a swing at you. This happens quite often. If somebody does take a swing at you, please just make sure your photographer is rolling. But you have to be prepared for that. And like I said, journalism is a messy business, and sometimes you have to get your hands dirty in terms of bringing the truth to light. But that's our job.